possible. My name is Darcy Berner. I am a recovering politician and a former programmer. I am also somebody who is a friend of Aaron Schwartz. Like Aaron, I started my career programming, and because in this room I feel like I need to trot out my geek credentials, I worked on C and C++ compilers and interpreters, programmed on Unix for a while, worked at Microsoft. I've dreamed in Prolog, so really, I am in fact fully a geek. But I'm also one of the people who has walked the halls of Congress, who has done whip counts, who has tried to formulate strategy, who's tried to figure out what is and isn't possible for us to do in this political environment. And in the process of doing that, I learned some things that might be useful, some of which I had conversations with Aaron about, and some of which I never had a chance to talk with him about. In the last 2 months or so, there is a question that I have been asking over and over again, which was maybe most poetically phrased as, who breaks a butterfly on a wheel? Why would anybody take this friend of mine who was brilliant and sensitive and amazing and spending all of his time trying to make the world a better and more just place and destroy his life? Why would anybody do that? We will get to that. The answer to that question is about power, and when I first came to DC, I have a friend who's a retired general, and he asked me in a very early conversation when I was in DC, who are your enemies? I think it's a really important question for us to consider here, not only who Aaron's enemies were, but who our enemies are, and why they are our enemies, because it's instructive when we think about what comes after Aaron. It would be very easy for us to say that the problem is fundamentally a couple of overzealous prosecutors. And I've seen that in a lot of places, that the blame goes to the specific prosecutors. Aaron actually talked in his blog in one of his later posts about fundamental attribution error. The idea that we say it's a personality flaw, when in fact the problem is the system in which people are operating. The problem that Aaron faced was that he challenged people in power, that he was viewed as a threat by them, that a lot of what we do is a threat to people who currently have power, and that that threat meant that they wanted to make an example out of him. When we talk about power, there are basically 6 types of power that get exercised in our society. How do you get other people to do what you want them to do? And the first 3 are fairly straightforward. Economic power, which is one of the things that always comes to mind when people are thinking about power. The Koch brothers, Bill Gates, AT&T, the oil companies all exercise economic power. They have the ability to deploy resources. All of us collectively also exercise economic power in ways that actually matter, even if we don't think about it. When you buy organic food, you are changing the way farming happens in this country. When you decide that when people decided to divest from South Africa, right, that they weren't going to buy products that were made in South Africa during apartheid, that had an impact in the aggregate that was much greater than the individual. But so economic power is one type. Standing just north of Washington, D.C., of course, political power is a second type. Not only who gets elected, but what it's possible for them to do once they do get elected. I spent a lot of time talking about the filibuster and filibuster reform and the constraints that the rules provide on political power and the ability of the American people to impact what happens in Washington, D.C. And then enforcement power, military, police, the courts, not only what our troops do in Iraq and Afghanistan, what our police do here, what the FBI does or doesn't do here, what the courts say, protection for First Amendment. Those are the 3 forms of power most people think about first when they are thinking about power. But they're not actually the stronger of the 6 forms of power. This is the weak set. It's the weak set because it doesn't scale very well. It doesn't scale very well across large numbers of people, and it doesn't scale very well across large amounts of time. As anybody who has ever attempted to discipline a small child can tell you, you can only force people to do things for a relatively short period of time. And eventually, if you want the behavior to continue, you have to get their consent. And it's the forms of power that are based around consent that turn out actually to be more important and turn out to be why a free and open network is so critical to the future of humanity. Consent-based power comes in two basic forms, with a third form that is necessary to exercise either of them. One of those two forms is cultural power, the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. So in 1960, building on the legacy that Jim Crow had left this country, Harper Lee published a book called To Kill a Mockingbird, which was followed shortly thereafter by a film, which changed the stories in the heads of white Americans about the justice system and the impact of race on justice. It was measurable in the polling that they saw and was imperative to the progress that the civil rights movement made, that there were a number of people who stopped consenting to that level of injustice in our society because the stories in their heads changed. There's a more recent example that I really like, which has been playing out. In fact, Washington State, my home state, had a fairly significant benchmark in December, which is we've seen just in the last few years the acceptance of the LGBT population and the idea of same-sex marriage completely change in the minds of the American public. And I will give you a quick example. When I was running the first time for Congress in 2006, the Washington State Supreme Court was considering a court case which would have legalized same-sex marriage in Washington. And the support among the public in Washington State for same-sex marriage in 2006 was 42%. So significantly less than half, 42%. This November, Washington State passed by popular vote a ballot initiative which made same-sex marriage legal in the state of Washington. A 6-year difference and almost a 20-point swing in how people felt about this issue, because the stories in their heads about who we are have changed. And they've changed in part because of the things that have been happening culturally. When you have people coming out of the closet, and it becomes your friend or your coworker or your sibling or your aunt or your uncle, rather than some abstract stranger, that changes the stories in people's heads. When you have things on television, everybody I know thinks they now have a gay best friend because of Kurt Hummel. And it changes what becomes possible by changing what people are and are not willing to consent to. So cultural power, which builds the stories in people's heads about who we are. But there's a set of stories that runs deeper about who we are supposed to be and how well the world matches up with who we're supposed to be, the exercise of moral power. Now, the obvious example of the exercise of moral power is religion, in which we build consent around a set of ideas for behaviors. Most famously, perhaps in this country, the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which seems like, to me, a pretty good rule for society. But there's a flip side to moral power, which is really important for us to understand, which is not just religion, but protest. Demonstrating the difference between the world that we, as we think it ought to work, and the world that we actually live in. How big is the difference between our values and reality? If you look at what happened during the civil rights movement, African American college students in the South did not have economic power. They did not have political power. They sure as heck did not have enforcement power on their side. So what kind of power was it that they exercised when they sat down and protested? They were demonstrating how big the gap was between Americans' ideas of what the world ought to work like and the way it actually works. It turns out, being an engineer, that I have attempted to reverse engineer what actually makes protest work, because as a Gen Xer, if I have one more baby boomer tell me all we need is a march on Washington, I will have to do something violent. But it turns out that there is in fact a formula, and it's very consistent if you look at the times and places all over the world in which protest has worked. The formula has 5 components. First, the people doing the protesting have to be perceived as innocent of any wrongdoing by their intended audience, by the people that they are trying to get to stop consenting to the injustice. It's why non-violent protest is so important. The minute you throw a rock or hold a gun or do something else where people can blame you, this ceases to be true. The people doing the protesting have to voluntarily put themselves in harm's way for the sake of the cause that they are fighting for. They have to then have the use of force, generally official force, come down upon them. You have to have officials actually do something bad to you, which then gets broadcast widely to the audience that you're trying to reduce consent for the injustice among, and shocks their consciences. Those are the 5 elements. If you want protest that will actually change the world, that's how you do it. So let's look at some examples. Fire hoses, children. It's very difficult to say that grade school children are not innocent of wrongdoing when they are non-violently protesting. And when you have the sheriff's office turning fire hoses on them, that is a very shocking thing and changes how people think about the problem. Same thing with dogs. Kent State, right? The same basic formula. People who are innocent of any wrongdoing, protesting, putting themselves voluntarily on the line for the sake of this, seeing official force come down on them in a way that was broadcast widely and shocked the conscience. Tiananmen Square, same basic formula. The Arab Spring protests, same basic formula. This is from my hometown of Seattle. The Occupy movement, same basic formula. When did Occupy get attention? The Occupy movement got attention when you had a cluster of young women who were trapped inside police barricades in New York get pepper sprayed by the police. It got attention when you had Dorley, who is in her 80s, protesting and get pepper sprayed rather vigorously by the police. It got attention when you had a group of students sitting on the sidewalk at UC Davis get pepper sprayed by the police. But the key here is that these were all broadcast very broadly. The YouTube channel for the pepper sprayed UC Davis students, that video had 2.5 million views in a very short period of time. The internet meant that rather than it being something that just outraged students at UC Davis, it became something that could outrage people all over the country. And then made its way onto broadcast television. The 6th form of power, and the one that matters the most to the people in this room, is network power. Who will listen to you? Who can you talk to? Who are you connected to? Because it is impossible to exercise either cultural power or moral power if you don't have the networks in place, if you don't have the ability to broadcast. It is not possible for the governed to fully consent if they're not allowed to communicate. And it isn't possible to change that consent unless you have a way to communicate with them very broadly, whether you're doing it by changing the stories in people's heads or whether you're doing it by showing them how different the world is than they think it ought to be. The network matters. And what Aaron was doing that was such a threat is frankly what everyone in this room is doing, which is a threat to people in power, which is building out a network. Now, I'm going to make the argument that those of you in this room and the people who build the network are among the most powerful people on the planet. And if that doesn't scare you at least a little bit, it should, because it means two things. One, it means that people who have power, whether they have economic power, political power, militaries, you're the greatest threat that faces them. Allowing folks in Egypt to organize themselves overthrew the Egyptian government. And all over the world, the network represents that level of threat. But the other side of it is that the poor all over the world, given the opportunity to organize, probably aren't going to be that fond of those of us who feel entitled to all of the latest gadgets, because there is a certain amount of injustice in how we're living, and so we're going to get it from both sides. And yet the fight is worth it. If we believe, as I do, and as Aaron did, that there is no fight more worth having than the fight for small d democracy, and the fight for the idea that every person matters, that every person should be able to fully have a voice in their government, then there is nothing we can do that's more important than building the network out so that everyone can use it, and protecting it so that no government, no corporation, no entity can censor what people can say on that network. In one of his last posts, Aaron said, when there's a problem, you shouldn't get angry with the gears, you should fix the machine. The problem that we have isn't with a specific prosecutor who was going after him for downloading JSTOR articles. The problem that we have is a system problem in which we represent a threat to people in power. Aaron isn't going to be the last person that they go after. If you represent a real threat, they will go after you. They will go after others of us and try to make examples of us. One of the things that I found saddest about how things played out with Aaron is, if I had known what was going on, I would have tried to help. I think that the outpouring of support from all over the country and all over the world would have blown him away. The degree to which the people he knew cared about him and the people he didn't know cared about him. But there was no precedent in his mind for the idea that anyone would help him if he reached out and asked for help. Because by and large, we have not had an ethos in which we do nearly enough to protect the people that the government goes after. It's far too easy to say, oh, he did something wrong, he must have done, they wouldn't come after me. They're going to come after you if you're a threat. They will come up with a reason. And if we do not protect each other, they will succeed. The thing that I would ask all of you to think about as you leave today, as you leave tomorrow, in Aaron's honor is, how do we help and support and protect the next Aaron? Thank you.